This year, the keynote address is going to be delivered by Susan Cobb Grandin. Susan is the immediate past director of the Division of State Lands, Department of Environmental Protection for the state of Florida. The division serves as a staff to the governor and the cabinet, sitting as the board of trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund, and handles all real estate matters for the 12 million acres of upland and submerged lands owned by the state. As director, Susan was responsible for overseeing the Bureau of Appraisal, the Bureau of Real Estate Services, the Bureau of Survey and Mapping, the Bureau of Public Land Administration, Office of Environmental Services, and the Office of Cabinet Affairs. Prior to her experience with state land, she was president of the Preservation Law Group, a Florida corporation that assisted clients in land use and real estate matters, and specialized in the preservation and protection of military installations and civilian airfields by preserving encroaching incompatible land uses. Prior to forming the Preservation Law Group, Susan was the director of the Jacksonville office of the Trust for Public Lands, a national nonprofit land conservation organization. Through her 12-year career with the TPL, Susan directly negotiated the purchase and sale of 35 land transactions totaling 1,402 acres with a purchase price of over $59 million. Before joining the Trust for Public Lands, Susan practiced as an attorney representing clients with issues involving zoning, land use, new urbanism, historic preservation, environmental and riparian rights. She was in private practice from 1997 until 2000, and prior to that served as Assistant General Counsel for the City of Jacksonville, Florida, in the Environmental Land Use Division prior to that. She received a law degree from Mercer University's Walter F. George School of Law and a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from the University of Florida. So please join me in welcoming Susan Cobb Grandin.
Thank you very much, Professor Hall. I appreciate that. I am Susan. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. I am in between jobs. Last week I was the Director of State Lands for the state of Florida, and next week I'll be starting with the City of Jacksonville Office of General Counsel. So this week I'm just having a relaxing week, standing up here talking to you guys. But I am very happy to be here. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about the stewards of our state lands. So in doing that, I'm going to start a little bit with the history of our state lands and then go into a little background about the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, because they are the staff to the Board of Trustees that Eric talked about in my introduction. So here's a little history lesson to begin with. One of the interesting things in working with the Division of State Lands is they have a full-time historian on staff there, Dr. Joe Knesh. He's been there since 1987, and he actually helps a lot with some of the title determinations and things like that. But he wrote up a little history of Florida's land, and I took some excerpts from that. But it's history that you learn about anyway. So in 1821, the United States bought Florida from Spain for $5 million. So some of the land, you probably heard of Spanish land grants, some of the land had already been conveyed out directly from Spain to private individuals, but all the land that had not been conveyed out was purchased by the United States government in 1821. In 1845, Florida became part of the Union, and at that time the U.S. Congress granted 500,000 acres to the state of Florida for internal improvement, is what they called it back then. Those 500,000 acres were selected by a surveyor that was actually chosen by Florida from the U.S. Surveyor General's office in Florida. Excuse me. In 1850, there was the Swamp and Overflowed Lands Act. So you'll probably, if you do any kind of real estate transactions at all in Florida, you'll hear about the Swamp and Lands Act. And that basically was an act of Congress that gave swamp and overflowed lands to all the new states in the Union. And in Florida, that equated to about 21 million acres of land. And they call it the Swamp and Overflowed Lands Act, but not all the land was actually either swampy or overflowed. In Florida, it consisted of a lot of the coastal, or the central ridge in Florida, which is certainly not overflowed. It does not include sovereign land, which is a very important distinction. At least it was for my career the last 15 months. In 1855, the Florida legislature created the Internal Improvement Fund, which was the body or agency that was authorized to deal with the land, the 500,000 acres that were given to Florida to begin with, and then the 21 million acres. In order to hold title to that land, so that's why you see with Property Appraisers Database, you'll see the Internal Improvement Trust Fund or the Board of Trustees and the Internal Improvement Trust Fund. That's who actually holds title to the state's land. So it vested title in the Board of Trustees. So the Board of Trustees still, as it was then, it still is now, the Governor and Cabinet. So Governor Scott, Attorney General Pam Bondi, Commissioner of Agriculture Adam Putnam, and the Chief Financial Officer Jeff Atwater. Those are the Cabinet. They're elected separately, of course, and the Governor is as well. So those four are the Governor and Cabinet, and they sit as the Board of Trustees in the Internal Improvement Trust Fund. So after the Civil War, a federal court entered an injunction against Florida for the Board of Trustees, basically. They couldn't give away any more land or use it as collateral until they paid off the bonds that the land was used as collateral for in making some of the internal improvements, railroads and things like that. And that stopped development in Florida for a while, but in 1881, Florida was kind of broke after the Civil War, as you might imagine. In 1881, a fellow named Hamilton Diston, D-I-S-S-T-O-N, came to the state of Florida. He was a wealthy Philadelphia saw manufacturer, but he basically bought a lot of acres, 4 million acres of swamp and overflow lands for about $1 million. That's 25 cents an acre, I guess, something like that. So Hamilton Diston was pretty much engaged in draining the Everglades, is what he set out to do. And because some of that was swamp and overflow lands, which is what he got as part of his 4 million acres. So he paid the state $1 million, and then he got that 4 million acres. And there's a lot of case law out there, and a lot of the work that the Division of State Lands does in determining which land is actually sovereign submerged lands and which land are uplands. And that's a very interesting dichotomy and line that you have to set out there. And the Hamilton-Diston sale comes into play quite often regarding that. Because all the land in Florida back then was unmapped and unsurveyed, surveyors were really, really important. And the state land records of all of the surveys that were done back then are all kept in the Douglas building in Tallahassee, which is affectionately known as the Copper Top building because it looks like a copper top battery. A 10-story building out there in Tallahassee where DEP's headquarters are. And they're stored in a place called the Vault. So it's air-conditioned, controlled, fire-resistant, that kind of thing, because it honestly does have really, really old maps and really old deeds. And if you ever have a chance to go to Tallahassee and go to the Douglas building and see that, you really should take advantage of it. It's pretty cool. In 1969, the Department of Natural Resources was created, and that's where the Division of State Lands was housed as the staff to the Board of Trustees then. And in 1975, the Department of Environmental Regulation was created that took in the old air and water pollution control and the sanitary engineering department. And in 1993, DER, Department of Environmental Regulation, and DNR, where the state lands was housed, were merged together to form Department of Environmental Protection, so that's what we have today. So the Division of State Lands has been the Board of Trustees staff for a long time, a lot of years. Now, since 1993, it also includes the all of DEP. And so even though it's been 21 years since DER and DNR have been merged, so there's the regulatory side, which is DER, and DNR, which was the proprietary side, which is what state lands is. Even though they've been merged for over 20 years, there's still a division there a little bit. They're working on it, they're getting better at it, but there's still a little bit of division. And I appreciated the comments of the earlier speakers about compliance and about how the regulators, particularly in Florida, I wanted to talk about, are really trying to help people, help the regulated community comply with the environmental laws. DEP, of course, has an air program, water program, waste program, a coastal office. They have the siting board, which is the huge transmission lines and where they go, and they have 6 district offices. The Northeast Florida District Office is right next door, of course, over here in a building just to the west, I suppose, of here. So there's air, water, and waste. And when I first started at DEP, 'cause people move around within DEP quite a bit, and they would say, well, so-and-so, he came from air. Came from air? Well, I guess it's better than coming from waste. I don't know. It's, air, waste, water. But it's a very interesting dichotomy there at DEP, because there are the regulators, there's the engineers and the biologists, and then state lands has all the real estate people, and the appraisers and the surveyors and the mappers and that kind of thing, and the real estate professionals, so it's very interesting. But the compliance assistance program, I did want to talk about the regulators a little bit, because that is something that DEP is really pushing right now. They're trying to help people comply. So instead of enforcement, whack somebody over the head, aha, gotcha, when somebody does something wrong, they really do, as Stacy said, you can call DEP and ask them, like, oh, you know, starting a new business, what should I do? Or I think I might have this problem, what should I do? And they really are trying to help people comply. So that's why they call it Compliance Assistance Program, the CAP, rather than just enforcement. So the compliance rates for DEP or for Florida regulated communities is about 96%. And that's the highest it's ever been. And they've determined that it really, people, as Stacy said, really do want to, most of the regulated community, wants to comply. They just sometimes don't know how, don't exactly know the rules, because the rules are a little complicated. So this is trying to help them. But on the other hand, if there are bad actors out there, DEP definitely takes enforcement action against them. One of the examples of success in 2012 in the air program, so it came from air, the air emissions from Florida's industrial emitters hit their lowest level since 1985. So we've got cleaner air now than we ever have, really. So DEP is actually divided into three areas. There's a regulator part, a regulatory part, the proprietary part, which is what I was part of, and then there's the state parks. So the regulatory side has about 4,000 employees, just to give you an order of magnitude. Parks has about 1,500 employees, and they run all our state parks, so they're park rangers and everything. And then state lands has about 105 employees. So we do have 161 parks, so people should get out there and enjoy them. They are the gold medal winner, national gold medal winners, the parks, our state parks, for the third time. No other state park system has ever even won it twice, and we've now won it 3 times. So once in 1999, 2005, and then 2013. So really get out there and enjoy those state parks. So for the proprietary side, state lands, I did want to spend a little bit more time on that. And as Professor Hull said, the state of Florida owns 12 million acres of land. 3.1 million acres of those acres are in conservation. They're conservation lands. About 200,000 acres are non-conservation lands. So that's state prisons, state hospitals, universities, that type of thing. And 9 million acres is the sovereign submerged land. So that is a big part of what state lands deals with, the sovereignty submerged lands, and it's just a very interesting area of the law if you go into that. So for state lands, there are 2 major programmatic areas that they work on. They do real estate transactions, so they buy and sell property, and they do real estate management and oversight. State lands itself, DEP doesn't manage any lands. Well, let me take that back. State parks manages lands, but the Division of State Lands doesn't actually manage any land. They're more like the property manager, just doing the leasing and that type of thing. But they also check up on their tenants. Their tenant could be state parks or Department of Corrections or forestry, to make sure that what they're doing on the state's land is what they said they were going to do. So for acquisitions, as you might imagine, the state of Florida buys a lot of conservation land, or at least we used to. We used to get $300 million a year from the legislature to buy conservation lands. That was through Preservation 2000 and Florida Forever. During the time of Preservation 2000 and Florida Forever, the state acquired about 2.4 million acres of conservation land. So, and they call those the go-go days, because I've seen the charts of how much money we spent and how many acres we purchased over those periods of time, and it's astounding. And the Division of State Lands was much larger at that time. It had a lot more staff to deal with all those acquisitions, as you can imagine. Those were the go-go days. The process for actually acquiring land for the state of Florida is it has to go through something called the Acquisition and Restoration Council, ARC, which is a governor appointed and some of the other cabinet members appointed body of 9 people that looks at potential projects or potential acquisitions, and typically a Florida Forever project is what we're going to talk about now. A project area may have several hundred parcels in it, dozens of landowners, or it could just have one landowner. But if it meets the criteria that are set out in Chapter 259 in Florida statutes, 259.105 specifically is the Florida Forever section, then it goes through the process to get approved and then get put on a priority list and then hopefully one day acquired. The priority list is very long. There are a lot of project areas on it. The one closest here is the Northeast Florida Timberlands, which Mark Middlebrook is very familiar with, and a lot of you guys here in the audience are. That's one of the Florida Forever project areas, so hopefully some of that will be purchased if the money comes back. So the funding, like I said, used to be about $300 million a year. There's $58 million left in the fund to purchase conservation lands, and a lot of those, there are transactions in the work being negotiated right now that hopefully are going to spend that money probably by the end of the year. There's also a constitutional amendment that's being proposed out there that's going to be on the ballot in November. It's going to be amendment number 1, and it's called the Water and Land Legacy for Florida. And it's going to add Section 28 to Article 10 of the Florida Constitution. And I thought I would just read the ballot summary for you just so you'll know what it says. So the official ballot text reads, funds the Land Acquisition Trust Fund to acquire, restore, improve, and manage conservation lands, including wetlands and forests, fish and wildlife habitat, lands protecting water resources and drinking water sources, including the Everglades, and the water quality of rivers, lakes, and streams, beaches and shores, outdoor recreational lands, working farms and ranches, and historic geologic sites by dedicating 33% of net revenues from the existing excise tax on documents for 20 years. So that existing excise tax is actually documentary stamp tax. It's the real estate transfer tax, basically, and other things, for 20 years. So the folks that figure out what the doc stamp revenue is going to be for the state of Florida say that that's going to be 33% of that is going to be $648 million in fiscal year 2015 and 16. So there's still Florida Forever bonds to pay off, so even after you take off the debt service for that year, which is about $150 million, you have about $500 million to spend. So I read for you the things that this could be spent for. That's a lot of money, $500 million. And it goes for 20 years, and because they're expecting Florida to grow and have more real estate transactions, in the 20th year, it's going to be $1.268 billion. A third. That's only a third of the revenue. So that's a lot of money. And so a lot of the proponents of this say that it's going to help drinking water and it's going to preserve places for tourists to come, and this is what makes Florida special. The opponents say, and the opponents include the Speaker of the House, the President of the Florida Senate, and the Commission of Agriculture. And they actually use a kind of a legal or civics argument. They say that they don't think the budget of the state of Florida should be dictated by the Constitution. That it makes it, just like California, all the constitutional mandates in California make it very hard for the legislature to actually balance the budget in California. So those are the arguments for and against it, but that is a lot of money. It's probably going to pass, that's my prediction, because it's going to go on the ballot in November. Unless it has some very organized opposition, I think it probably will pass, because it's about water and land. And everybody wants to have good drinking water. That polls very high in every state in the union when people talk about that. So they did that by getting petitions signed. They needed 600 and something thousand petitions. They got over 1 million certified petitions. So If that passes, the Division of State Lands will be very busy again, probably. So that would be great. The Division of State Lands also does non-conservation acquisition, so they help universities and other non-conservation agencies of the state purchase land when they need to do that. We did that a lot with FSU recently and doing some exchanges and whatnot. Interesting. Then the Division of State Lands also does the disposition of both conservation and non-conservation lands. For the disposition of conservation lands, the legislature last year directed the Division of State Lands to go through a conservation land assessment process and determine if there was up to $50 million of land that would no longer be needed for conservation purposes that could be surplused in order to take those revenues and buy higher conservation valued land. We went through that process. I'm very proud of the process. We had third-party independent GIS analysts to help us. That was just one little piece of the puzzle. We had the managing agencies helping us figure out which pieces of land that they managed could be surplus and no longer needed for conservation purposes. And we actually had a lot of public input, which was really good. We appreciated it. We started the public process very early on with the list when it was very raw. We had a huge list, put it out there on the web and got comments that were very helpful. And the public got to see us kind of making the sausage as it went along. So interesting process. But as it goes along, this list got smaller and smaller, and it did show to me that it was a very good assessment. It was a very good idea to take stock of what you've had for 40 years. If you had a stock portfolio, for instance, you wouldn't just buy stock and never look at it again. I mean, you always kind of look at it and assess, is this still a good stock to have? Should I buy something else? So that's the way that we looked at this. We looked at the assessment as doing just that. And it turns out that during the go-go days, when we were spending about $300 million a year, the Division of State Lands actually bought some really good property. So that's the way I look at that. And that report was turned into the Board of Trustees in October of last year. And I think it was a good process to have gone through, personally. So for the disposition of non-conservation land, that's another very interesting issue that is going on with the Division of State Lands right now because of the privatization of some of the prisons and things like that. We have big prisons, hospitals, Department of Juvenile Justice facilities, that type of thing that the division needs to dispose of. Some of the prisons are in Hendry County, Glades County, Hillsborough County, Gainesville, and those all present, as you might imagine, who wants to buy a prison? The Hendry County prison is in the middle of nowhere. But interestingly enough, there's a lot of prospective buyers out there that have some creative ideas on what to do with that property. And there's a hospital, A.G. Holly Hospital, which was a tuberculosis hospital in Palm Beach County that closed. It's about 80 acres east of I-95 in Palm Beach County, one big square. That's going to be a good one. And there's going to be a lot of revenue, I think, coming to the state of Florida for that. We have to go through a competitive bid process on any lands that are sold, whether it's conservation or non-conservation. It's put out for bid a certain period of time and then sold at a competitive bid, so the highest bidder wins. For the A.G. Holly Hospital, the first competitive bid was unsuccessful. We didn't get anybody responsive, so we changed it and we're able to make it more market friendly. In terms of the due diligence period, the way the contract was set up, and the fact that you didn't have to actually put down 10% of your bid price for a deposit, which was, if you're going to bid $15 million on something, putting down a $1.5 million deposit is a little startling. So the bids that we did get in, and I still say we because it's so fresh, it's just last week, range between $10 million and $15.6 million, so that's pretty good. The other major part of what Division of State Lands does is the management and oversight. So all the leases, there's thousands of upland leases and thousands of submerged land leases that they deal with, and the upland oversight is both for conservation and non-conservation purposes. The submerged land has to do with the public trust doctrine. And in the submerged land section that deals with leases and easements and consent of use and things like that, that's where the regulatory side and the proprietary side intermingle. So for sovereign submerged land's use, it has to be not contrary to the public interest, and this is in the Constitution as well as in Chapter 253 of the Florida statutes. And for sovereign submerged land sale, it has to be in the public interest. So those are the two standards that we look at. The support services that Division of State Lands has, I mentioned earlier about the surveying. So they have surveying and mapping, they have a big section of that. And that also is the title determination. So when somebody wants to put in a dock, for instance, they have to prove that they have sufficient upland interest. That goes to the title section, and they look at that. Then it goes back to the regulatory folks to do the permitting, and then the person also has to get a lease if it meets certain thresholds. And the division has a Bureau of Appraisal, which does a lot of appraisals. They actually hire fee appraisers to do that for the lands that the state buys or sells or leases or gives an easement over. So that's just a broad overview of who it is that looks after the state-owned lands in Florida. And I hope I didn't bore you to death, but it's something to me that I found when I took the job as State Lands Director over a year ago. I had no idea that it did all that stuff. I mean, I was mostly engaged in the land acquisition part of it, and a little bit with the sovereign submerged lands, but they do a lot of stuff, and it was great working for them. Although I'm very happy to be back, very happy. Thank you all very much. I'll take any questions if anybody has any. Sure.
I guess I could talk about microphone. Dana Brown, 2 questions, and they're all in the newspaper. A two-parter. The first one is, several months ago, the Florida Fish and Wildlife and Conservation Commission asked for DEP to release the 2,000-acre parcel in Green Swamp, Polk County, but it's still on the list. Do you know if there's any timeline for releasing that parcel, or is DEP going to be holding on to it? And the second one is, what do you see for the future of the Division of State Lands now that you and your second in command have left the division, and where do you see the division going forward?
To answer the first question about the Green Swamp parcels, is that what the high-low chief pieces?
Right.
FWC did ask to have those removed. The list hasn't been officially changed since October, but as we went through the process, all throughout it, if a managing agency asked for a piece of property to be removed, it was. So the list hasn't been changed since October. It hasn't been published. Excuse me. But I don't see that would be any different. The second question is, Division of State Lands is going to be just fine. Stephanie, who was the Cabinet Affairs Director and my Assistant Director, had a fantastic offer from the Cancer Society, and so she went to work with them. And so they had brought in a fellow actually from the Northwest District Office. His name's Cliff Wilson. So he and I were going to run the division, and he's just awesome. So I feel like it's in really good hands. He got up to speed in a couple of weeks. Very smart guy, only sleeps 4 hours a night. Good for him, because that's about what he's going to need, or only get to have is about 4 hours of sleep a night. But I think it'll be fine, because that division really, I mean, it runs well anyway. So, but thanks for asking. Good to see you, Dana.
Eric Suma.
Thank you. Thank you.
We might be more thrilled than you are.
In the past, the lands program has done a great job with interconnecting lands that are purchased. Do you see that continuing in the future, and do you see an integration of that effort with other state regulatory efforts such that those potential interconnections that have not been purchased yet will remain in some type of status such that regulatory entities could see those areas and make their decisions appropriately?
That's a very good question. The interconnectivity is one of those things for wildlife corridors and all types of things that's really important in terms of the criteria. When we looked at lands to purchase, right now there's a big focus on springs and water quality, as I think there should be. We looked at, does the piece of property that we're going after positively affect water quality to purchase it? And does it meet the other criteria of Florida Forever, which are found in 259.105? So it would be interconnectivity, it'd be endangered species habitat, rare species, that type of thing. So the more criteria that it hit, the better. And if you could buy it for, 90% of appraised value or less, if it was less than fee, and if there were partnerships. So if there was other money coming in, whether it's federal money or local money or even nonprofit money, all those things come together. I mean, it makes it a challenge to purchase property because you have to hit so many marks, but it makes it more certain that the pieces of property that you do buy are actually going to be helpful. So in doing some of the things with the springs, because water quality is such a focus right now, the division, we had put together a team of people working with the water quality folks in DEP. They're called Division of Environmental Assessment and Restoration, that do the BMAPs around the state to get their input on which piece of property would actually be the best to help water quality. And it's typically what they would lift up as being important isn't something that would typically be a Florida Forever type of project, because it would be like center pivot agriculture that's right next to a spring. So of course a center pivot agriculture is taking water out of the aquifer and putting nutrients back in, so that's really not very good for water quality. So we were going after those type of purchases as well. So the interconnectivity, not only physically, but in the thought process of trying to make the environment better. That's really what they were doing, and still are.
Hi, Susan.
Mark?
One question I've had is the Florida Land and Water Legacy campaign, when and if it passes, the legislature still has a lot of latitude in terms of within environmental programs, what they do with that funding. I think there's a big assumption that it'll return to the go-go days with the Florida Forever program, but that's not necessarily how it will turn out. So kind of how do you see the future of that program going on, assuming it passes?
Well, it really does, and you're absolutely right. It really does matter on how the legislature drafts the implementing language for the bill on that. But like I said, $500 million is a lot, and even if $50 million a year was put towards land acquisition, that would be better than what we've had during the recession. A lot of it would probably go to land management, which I think is also a good thing, because we, as a state, have gotten a lot of criticism from the legislature and from just general citizens that we don't have the money to manage the lands that we have. Why are we buying more lands? That type of argument. So I think the management of land is critically important. But I personally, and I don't know, but I mean, I personally think that there will be some money there for land acquisition.
We have time for one more question. Anyone? Okay.
Could you describe on what I'll call to that last water issue, do we put deed restrictions or other kinds of use limitations on properties if we have particular concerns about their use and impact on water quality, or do we leave that to the permitting decision to DEP?
You mean if it were to be purchased in less than fee?
Yes.
Yes, and that is actually one of the tools in the toolbox to use to craft the conservation easement, or even if it's just a restrictive use easement, in such a way that it would do that. And one of the ideas being tossed around was not to limit a specific kind of crop, but to actually limit putting fertilizer on it, for instance. So if you wanted to grow measly little corn, you could do that, but you might want to grow peanuts that might not take as much fertilizer, that type of thing. So that's definitely one of the tools in the toolboxes. Well, thank you all very much. I enjoyed it.